Okay, hello everyone. My name is Tiffany Landry. I'm the Director of Advocacy for the 6th District of the California State PTA. I want to welcome all the PTA members in the audience, as well as educators, families, and community members from across the state. I thank you for all the work and volunteerism you do in service of the PTA mission, which is to positively impact the lives of all children and families. 6th District PTA supports PTAs in the counties of Santa Clara, Santa Cruz, Monterey, and San Benito. 6th District PTA provides training for PTA officers, assistance for you to successfully run your meetings, and many other programs like the one tonight. So I'd like to give you a really quick background on our program tonight. Last year, the delegates at the California State PTA Convention adopted a resolution called Teaching Hard History, American Slavery in K-12 Education. That resolution acknowledges that American enslavement is important history, although it's challenging to teach. The resolution encourages PTAs to advocate for things that teachers need to teach this hard history. So that's things like professional development opportunities, classroom materials, and improvements to curriculum. The resolution also encourages PTA members to continue to learn about this history to help us be the best advocates that we can be. So tonight we'll be learning some history. There will be time for questions after the presentation. We will collect your questions in the Zoom Q&A feature, so please put your questions there. The chat is a second way to communicate with the support team in case you have technical issues or need some assistance finding the Q&A feature. The program is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel in the coming days. So now on to our event. I welcome Tammerlin Drummond from the ACLU of Northern California to inform everyone here today about an educational project on the history of slavery in California. Ms. Drummond is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and today at the ACLU, she uses storytelling to defend civil liberties. Welcome, Ms. Drummond. We appreciate this opportunity to learn from you, and I will turn the presentation over to you now.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, for that great introduction. And I'm just going to take 1 minute here to share my screen with you folks. Okay. I think you've got to give me access again, Tiffany.
My screen shows you as a co-host. Eric, can you assist? Is it?
You should be able to prove that now, Tamara.
Yeah, okay, here we go. Thank you. Okay. Can you see my screen okay?
I can.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you so much, Tiffany and the 6th District PTA for this opportunity to talk to you about our ACLU of Northern California project, Gold Chains, the Hidden History of Slavery in California. You know, one of our main goals in creating this public education project that I'll be sharing with you is really to get this information into the schools so that children can learn the history that, you know, certainly most of us never learned, and it was totally missing from our lessons in US history. I appreciate that you all have embraced and in fact pushed for a more nuanced and truthful approach to the teaching of slavery. Because as I don't have to tell you, there's a national fury over critical race theory with you know, many parents and politicians and educators and a whole bunch of other people denouncing efforts to give our students a more comprehensive understanding of the founding of the United States and of California. I think the title, Teaching Hard History, is really a great one for our discussion tonight because a lot of the information that I'm going to be talking about, it's very painful. And, it really brings up a whole host of emotions for a lot of people, because we're talking about, a lot of violence and dehumanization of people. And it's really hard to hear. But, I just want to say in the beginning that, it's okay to have these feelings, because this is not, we're not here to blame, anyone for events that happened, long before, we were even thought of. But this is really about us being able to have a dialogue and to really, seriously think about the many ways in which, racism in our institutions has kind of shaped the foundation and the society that we now have today in California and the rest of the country. And just to really think about, what that means for all of us today. So as you probably know, there's a lot of talk right now in California and across the country about reparations. This has really gained momentum, since this flurry of police killings involving unarmed Black people. Of course, about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and there have been many, many others. And here in California, actually, we have really taken a landmark step in that we are the first state in the whole country to create a state government commission to really look at our state's involvement in the enslavement of Black people, and to develop or to think about developing reparations proposals. And so that task force began meeting in June, and I'll get more into their charge a little bit later. And finally, as I touched on before, there's this whole big debate going on about critical race theory, which, there are a lot of definitions for it, but at its core, I like to think of it as really looking at how the social construct of race and institutionalized racism over several generations, has led to a kind of caste system here that subjects certain people to the bottom tiers. And of course, Isabel Wilkerson, if you have read the book Caste, or if you haven't, I would strongly recommend it. She really digs into this in depth, and this whole idea of, this kind of early imposition of second-class citizenship, and how that today really impacts so many elements of, our society, from, segregated schools and neighborhoods and, mass incarceration, and, just the list sort of goes on and on. Many of us were taught in California that we really had nothing to do with slavery. At least I know I was taught that slavery was always something that was, it was pretty much a Southern phenomenon. And then as I got older, I heard that, oh, well, they were actually, slaves in the North. And that California was really this sort of land of freedom, where that really was never an issue. And, California was a land of freedom, but that really, it's only partly true. Because, at least for many Black people, Indigenous people, Chinese people, Mexicans, our state not only allowed slavery to flourish, but actually really sanctioned it and helped pass laws and create policies that, really allowed this, institution to continue. And, while we didn't have any cotton plantations here, what we did have were gold fields. And we had Black people and Indigenous people who were forced to work for free in those gold fields, and also work as domestics and field laborers and, pretty much anything else that their enslavers demanded of them. And it's actually, you can trace the start of slavery in California to the story we've all heard about, which was when gold was discovered in Colma in 1848 in the Sierras. And during this big rush to California, a lot of white people from the South who were slave holders began forcibly bringing Black people into California to help them mine the gold fields. So that's why we named our project Gold Chains, to evoke that a lot of this early wealth that was extracted from California through gold was basically accumulated through the forced labor of Black and Indigenous people. And, we called it the hidden history of slavery because, pretty much nobody knows anything about it. You might wonder why a legal organization like the ACLU, where I work, would take on this kind of labor-intensive project about slavery. And it really took us, I'd say, probably about 6 months of research to pull this together. In a nutshell, it's really about educating Californians to help people to understand the root causes of a lot of the injustice today that drives so much of our advocacy and litigation work at the ACLU. So with that introduction, I just want to start out by telling you a little bit about some background about this Gold Chains project, which actually you can also look at if you want to follow up. It's got a really simple URL. It's just goldchainsca.org. But as you know, 1619 was the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Jamestown, Virginia. And, although there were certainly enslaved people in the colonies before that, 1619 has really become this symbolic date that marks the start of slavery in the US colonies. And of course, that's, 400 years later is when, the New York Times had their big project. And then there was a lot of real sort of discussion and national dialogue about, the impact of slavery and its legacy today. And what we found really interesting, and we started this, before we knew about the New York Times project, but there was still a lot of discussion that was ongoing at that time because it was the big anniversary. And what we thought was very interesting is that no one was talking about slavery in California. It was like, it didn't exist. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, many of us were taught that enslavement was something that happened, far away from here, and that our state, really didn't have any of the kind of baggage that other states have, that were known slaveholding states. But that's actually not the case. California not only had slavery, but from the early government was dominated at pretty much every level by Southern white men who had migrated here and who really used, the levers of power to make end runs around the state's ban on slavery so that they could hold on to their slaves. And in the years leading up to the Civil War, California's elected representatives consistently voted in favor of the pro-slavery Southern agenda. And in turn passed, these really horrible laws and policies, some of which I'm going to talk to you about, to kind of allow the enslavement of Black and Indigenous people in California. When we were working on this project, a lot of the people I talked to they were shocked to hear that slavery had happened in California. And, that's basically because it's not taught in schools. And it's because of who was writing the history books. And it's not that the history wasn't there. It's just that no one, or I should say very few historians had bothered to dig into it. So on the 400th anniversary, we decided to use this anniversary as a date to examine our own history in California of slavery. And so what you're looking at here on this cover image is it's an image of, an overseer on a boat, obviously, with, and some enslaved persons. And this is making the passage, crossing the Middle Passage. And it's a really powerful book of illustrations by the late artist Tom Feelings, which we decided to use as the main image for our website. And interestingly, as it turns out, a number of enslaved Black people in California were also brought here by sea during the gold rush, because the trip overland by wagon took, like 5 months across the plains and the mountains, whereas you could do it in about 17 days by sailing to Panama and then crossing the isthmus either by foot or horseback, and then sailing to California and then on to the port of San Francisco. which, at that time was known as Yerba Buena. So I want to start out, because I've been talking for quite some time, with a piece that I think really kind of sets the tone for what we're talking about. This is an audio piece that we wrote based on newspaper accounts and other reports at that time. And I'll just let you listen to this for a few moments.
It was October 29, 1861, in the basement of Tehama House, a popular hotel in downtown San Francisco. George Gordon, a barber and well-known activist in San Francisco's Black community, was at work, as he was most Tuesday mornings. A handful of customers waited for shaves and haircuts. Around 10:30, a white man named Robert Shell walked in the barbershop, accompanied by two other white men. Shell wasn't there for a haircut. He had come to confront Gordon over something that had happened the day before. Mrs. Gordon, George Gordon's wife, and her sister had reported Shell to the police. They had seen him walk into their hat store when he thought no one was there, pull open the cash drawer, steal $11, and leave. When police officers went to question Shell about the theft, he flew into a rage. How dare a Negro accuse him of a crime? When Shell arrived at the barbershop, he immediately confronted Gordon. He shouted, "That affair last night was not quite right." Gordon trusted that his wife and sister-in-law had seen what they said they had seen and refused to back down. He replied, "Yes, it was. You went down on the money." All of a sudden, Shell started beating Gordon with a cane. With blows so fierce, the wood split in two. The men grabbed each other in a clinch. Two customers intervened and pulled them apart. In the very instant they were no longer entangled, Shell pulled a pistol out from his pocket and shot Gordon in the chest. Gordon was mortally wounded, yet somehow he managed to stagger up the stairs and stumble out onto the street. Shell followed him, and then crouching over Gordon where he lay in the gutter, pistol whipped him in the face, continuing even after he was already dead. Shell was quickly arrested and indicted for murder. There was no doubt that Shell murdered George Gordon, an unarmed man, in cold blood fueled by racism. But in order for him to be convicted of first-degree murder, the prosecution had to prove it in court. The problem was, most of the customers in the barbershop were Black. At that time, California had a law that banned anyone with 1/8 or more of so-called Negro blood from testifying against a white person in criminal or civil court. That left the prosecution with one white eyewitness, or should we say, someone who identified as white. James Cowles was light-skinned with a wig of straight hair and said he was originally from Portugal. But the defense attorney challenged Cowles' testimony on the grounds that he was in fact a Black man and therefore legally prohibited from testifying against his client. The judge ordered Cowles to undergo a physical examination. In a courtroom crowded with spectators, two Southern doctors who professed to be experts in racial science examined Cowles' eyebrows with a microscope. They stripped off his wig and peered at his bald head. After that, they took him into another room to examine the hair follicles on parts of his body covered by his clothes. They concluded that Cowles had an unmistakable kink in his hair, a supposedly telltale sign that he was really Black. The hairology defense was a success. The judge declared that Cowles could not testify because he was in fact a Black man. The one white witness whose testimony the defense could not throw out had not seen the actual shooting. So Shell was convicted of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but only served 2. George Gordon's death was not in vain. There was widespread public outrage over the exclusion of testimony from eyewitnesses to his murder for the sole reason that they were Black. And that outcry ultimately helped bring about the repeal of these racist laws.
So in 1850, which is the same year that California became a supposed free state, the legislature passed this law called an Act Concerning Crimes and Punishment. And you see an excerpt from the language on the screen here. And this law lasted from 1850 to 1863. And what it basically did was it said that no Black person, well, you can see what it says, but then it added in 1854, Chinese people to this group that was basically excluded from giving any kind of testimony in a criminal or civil action. There was a parallel civil act. And so what this meant was that pretty much no people of color, if you were not white, you basically could not testify on your own behalf if you were a victim of a crime or if you were accused of committing one. And likewise, in civil disputes, you also had no legal standing. So this basically meant you had absolutely no protection under the law. By the same token, it meant that if a Black person was the only witness to give testimony to help, the case of a white person, they still could not testify because of this law. And I found it very powerful as we were doing this research to really see this spelled out in Black and white in these statutes. And this is one of the things that we really tried to do with this project, is that rather than just sort of telling stories, to really go through the government archives, historical societies, and other places where we could collect, the actual documents, so that people can understand that these are not just anecdotal stories, that this was actually the law. So what happens is that when these terrible testimony laws pass, it creates what is, pretty much the first Black civil rights movement in California, where people just organize to try to get these rules overturned. Because pretty much as long as these things are in effect, they cannot protect, their lives or their property. And so just to give you some idea, in 1850, there are about 25 million people in the United States, and about 3 million are enslaved Black people. There are about 420,000 Black people who are actually free. So you have a situation where, pretty much most of the Black population is enslaved, but you have still this national movement that starts up around the country. It's called the Colored Conventions movement. And the Colored Conventions starts up also in California. It's made up of people who were still gold miners, free Black and, formerly enslaved people, business people, ministers, newspaper people. And they began holding these gatherings in Sacramento at this the oldest Black church actually on the West Coast, now called St. Andrew's. And they organized to try to get these laws overturned. And so what you are looking at here, and they maintained this campaign for, as you can see, it was a really long time, more than 10 years. What you're looking at on the left this is actually an image that was done of one of these meetings in Washington, D.C. But, you can pretty much imagine it would have been a similar looking, it's very similar looking in Sacramento. What you're looking at to the right, which I just find absolutely fascinating, is this is a handwritten petition. It's in the archives of the California Historical Society, which kindly shared it with us. It is made out to the legislature. We have no idea who wrote it, but it's this meticulously written 4-page letter in which this person is respectfully calling for the legislature to overturn the testimony laws, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, that basically it prevents Black people from, protecting themselves and their property. and that it also, hurts white people when, the only witness to a crime cannot testify. The barber, as you heard in the audio clip I played, he had been very active at this colored convention in 1856. And, it's just a very sad irony that when he was murdered, the testimony laws would, just play this really devastating role in the prosecution of his killer. Now, the thing to know about the testimony laws is, even when they were finally repealed, they didn't just go away. I mean, this is basically what set the foundations for, the legal system that we have today. And just to give you some insight into that, I want to share a clip from an interview with Tyrion Steinbeck, who's a former ACLU attorney, and sort of how she sees the legacy of these testimony laws today.
One of the most important elements of our legal system is credibility. Race and even racial bias come up at every point along the way, from the point where people are arrested and there's discretion of a police officer to bring them in and arrest them or not, whether a district attorney or prosecutor is going to bring a case, has to do with the credibility of witnesses and the credibility of the defendant and the believability of the people involved in the process. And so at every stage, what is still true is that though there is not explicit laws that prevent Black people from testifying at all, what we know happens regularly at all levels of the legal systems is that the testimony of Black people is discredited, is considered in decisions of case strategy or how to put on witnesses and if people are going to be believed, and is absolutely considered in terms of who to have on juries and jury selection, and at every stage. What I think is actually equally interesting and isn't talked about as much is how this might come up in a civil context. Again, how people are perceived or valued if their testimony is thought of as credible, if their claim is to be believed, matters hugely in areas of people sorting out disputes over property, over payment, over income, over the many things that actually are crucial to our quality of life.
Okay, I just want to now move on to some key dates in California's founding, just to kind of help us orient where we are in time. So as I mentioned earlier, 1848 is when, gold is discovered at Sutter's Mill, and this launches the gold rush. And we've got, 300,000 people pouring into California from all over the world. 1850, we have the Compromise of 1850, which is when California enters the Union as a free state. And as I mentioned before, this is the same year that the legislature passes the testimony laws. 1852 to 1855, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, California passes its own Fugitive Slave Act. So this is different from the federal law that was already in existence, to legalize the enslavement of Black people who entered California before statehood. And then 1863 is when the testimony exclusion laws are finally repealed. I did want to mention that this actually does not happen until we are well into the Civil War. So I mentioned that California's early founders, many of these were pro-slavery Southerners who came here, in search of, gold, like many other people at that time. And what's interesting is a surprising number of them start running for elected office. You know, in 1850, more than a third of white people who are living in California are from slaveholding states, and they pretty much end up dominating every level of government, from, you know, local mayors to the state legislature, the congressional representatives, and they pretty much have a stranglehold over the local courts and the state Supreme Court. And one of the most notable of these people was our first elected governor, a man by the name of Peter Burnett, who I had never heard of until I started researching this project. And Peter Burnett was a Tennessean who pretty much had a single-minded passion to create a whites-only American West. And so Burnett, you know, came first to Oregon in the early 1840s. You know, he helped lead a wagon train, which is how a lot of people, you know, got out here at that time. And he got into the legislature there, where he pushed for a law that would basically ban Black people from the state. And if they did not leave within a certain period of time, they would then receive a certain number of lashes. This law was later rescinded, but when Burnett made his way to California, he again pushed for a similar law. He was unsuccessful, but it wasn't for a lack of trying. And I just wanted you to hear just a little snippet from a speech that he gave before the California legislature.
In my former message to the legislature, I recommended the necessity and propriety of excluding free persons of color from the state. Our Constitution excludes this class of persons from the right of suffrage and from all offices of honor or profit under the state. And our laws exclude them from serving on juries and from appearing as witnesses against a white man, without considering whether there be any reason for the opinion entertained by many learned persons that the colored races are by nature inferior to the white, and without attaching any importance to such opinion. Still, it may be safely assumed that no race of men, under the precise circumstances of this class in our state, could ever hope to advance a single step in knowledge or virtue. They have no ideas and no recollections of a separate national existence, no alliance with great names or families, no page of history upon which are recorded the glorious deeds of the past, no present privileges, no hope for the future. To expect any race of men thus situated to make any sensible improvement as a class is the wildest dream of the imagination, and utterly incompatible with all our sober experience. As all experience has demonstrated, it is for the mutual benefit of the parties to separate, even husband and wife, when they cannot live happily together. So it is the best humanity to separate two races of men, whose prejudices are so inveterate that they never mingle in social intercourse and never contract any ties of marriage.
So I just wanted to add that, you know, although Peter Burnett's vision was extreme, it certainly sounds extreme to us today, but, you know, it really fit within the kind of broader prevailing views at that time, you know, among, you know, white settlers who came to California, was that they really wanted, well, in Peter Burnett's case, he just wanted Black people basically, you know, out of the state, period. Okay. I don't know if any of you had a chance to listen to the first podcast that we did that was a spinoff of the website, but it featured California's own fugitive slave law. And it kind of revolves around what I like to think of as kind of our own Dred Scott decision. Basically, there were three Black men who had been brought to California as slaves and forced to work for no pay in the gold fields. the man who brought them to California decided that, he was going to return home to the South, and basically left these three men with a friend of his. And the deal was that they would supposedly work for 6 months for this other gentleman. And then if they did what was asked of them, they would be given their freedom after 6 months. So the friend, kept his end of the bargain. He freed the men after 6 months. They go on to start their own mining supply business, where they're basically providing supplies for all the people who are actually, working in the mines. And they end up making a huge amount of money. I mean, it's like in the matter of 4 months, they make the equivalent of what is about $100,000 today. Now, bear in mind, these are people who had been, enslaved, and they just start their own business and they start making all this money. Well, one day they are asleep in their cabin and there is a banging at the door, and it is the sheriff in Placer County. And they are arrested for being fugitive slaves. What ends up happening is that their former owner, who had returned to, and I always forget, I believe it's Mississippi, found out that California had just passed its own fugitive slave law, which basically meant that even though California was supposed to be a free state, our legislature decided that anybody who had been brought into California before it became a state, which was the case of these three miners, that they were still legally slaves, and that whoever had been their quote unquote owner could freely reclaim them and take them back to wherever they came from. So this case ended up going all the way to the state Supreme Court. And again, I mentioned earlier that we've got this sort of budding Black activism happening at this time. And a lot of people with white allies raise a lot of money to get a defense for these three miners. And as I mentioned, it goes all the way to the state Supreme Court. But basically, the state Supreme Court renders this terrible decision, which is, again, equivalent to Dred Scott, which you can read here. But it basically says that when the state constitution was passed, when they said freedom, they never meant to mean free Black people or fugitive slaves, and that pretty much the US Constitution guarantees the right of slaveholders. And it was just this horrible decision, which again is, certainly not taught about in schools. Okay. Now, there were a lot of different ways that, even though California was supposed to be a free state, that slaveholders could come into California and still manage to enslave Black people. And one of our most famous fugitive slave cases involved a man named Archie Lee, who had also been brought here from the South. And this is actually how I found out that California had slavery, because I stumbled upon a couple of years ago just a very small mention of this case and a reference to it having been California's most famous fugitive slave case. And I thought, well, how could California have a fugitive slave case if we never had slavery? So I dug around and found out that California, in addition to this other awful law, had another law that they called the Sojourner Law, which was similar to what they did in some of the free states back east, which was these laws allowed slaveholders to come into free states with their enslaved people as long as they supposedly were not planning to stay, as long as it was supposedly just a temporary trip. And so what happened in the case of Archie Lee is that he was brought here by this man named Charles Stovall, who claimed that he was just passing through. But in fact, this guy started up a school in Sacramento. He hired Archie Lee out to work for other people and pocketed his wages, which was kind of the thing that was done at that time. But when Archie Lee got here, again, there were all these free Black people here and formerly enslaved Black people. And, when they see enslaved people coming into the state, they start telling them that, you're not a slave anymore. You have a right to be free. And with the help of some of these people, Archie Lee runs away. And again, as in the case that I mentioned previously, a lot of money is raised to fight his case because the slaveholder is determined to get him back. He says that this is his property. He's worth $1,500. He wants his money. And it's a long-winded story with lots of twists and turns, but eventually the case goes to the federal court and Archie Lee is finally released. Now, one of the things that we wanted to really focus on is for this not just be just a lot of depressing material and to really focus on the agency that a lot of people had. I mean, as terrible as things were in California for many Black people, people did not sit back and take it. I mean, they used the courts to fight for their rights. And as you'll see from this story that I'm about to play for you, which is just one of my favorite stories, there were, white people in positions of power who managed to sort of circumvent the existing racist laws to, basically do the right thing. So this is a story about a woman named Biddy Mason, and I'm just going to share this with you.
In the early spring of 1848, the wagon train of Mormon settlers set out from Mississippi. They were headed west for Great Salt Lake Valley in Utah. Of the 90 men, women, and children, 34 were enslaved Black people. One of them was Bridget Mason, known as Biddy. She was forced to trek nearly 1,500 miles with her enslavers, Robert and Rebecca Dorn Smith. She walked through rain, mud, floods, and ice, all the while tending to oxen, serving the Smiths, and caring for her 3 young children. We know very little about Biddy's early life, except that she was born into slavery in 1818 and taken away from her mother as a baby. It's believed that Biddy was raised by older enslaved women who were like grandmother figures to her. With them, she learned the healing properties of plants and the gift of delivering babies. As a young adult, Biddy and her daughters were sent to toil for the Smiths on their tenant farm in Mississippi. That's how Biddy Mason ended up a forced laborer on a Mormon caravan. 3 years after arriving in Utah, California beckoned the Smiths, and Biddy was forced to move again. This time, Biddy Mason was forced to hike more than 400 miles through punishing desert to what is now San Bernardino. Slavery was illegal in California, but that did not stop the Smiths from holding Biddy and her daughters captive for 4 years. At a local market where Biddy purchased goods for the Smith family, it's believed that she became friends with free Black people who lived in the area. They encouraged Biddy to take her freedom. One day she learned, much to her alarm, that the Smiths were relocating to Texas and taking her and her children with them. It's believed that upon her departure, some of her free Black friends alerted the sheriff's office. The sheriffs produced a court order to the Smiths and took Biddy Mason and her children into protective custody. The Smiths denied Biddy Mason and her family were enslaved, insisting they were traveling to Texas of their own free will. Their freedom was now to be decided by the courts. Biddy's case was brought before Judge Benjamin Hayes. At that time, it was against the law for a person of color to testify against a white person in court. Biddy Mason would not be allowed to tell her story. However, when Biddy's lawyer did not show up to court, Judge Hayes did something very unusual. He called Mason into his chambers. If you return to Texas, he told her, you will have to leave your children behind. They cannot be unjustly imprisoned in a slave state. Biddy's response was emphatic. I do not wish to be separated from my children and do not in such case wish to go. Judge Hayes ordered Biddy and her children set free. A free woman, Biddy moved to Los Angeles, where she used her skills as a healer to find work. She became a doctor's assistant and started a business as a midwife. Saving her earnings and buying property, Biddy Mason became one of the richest people in Los Angeles. She was celebrated for her generous philanthropy. Biddy Mason founded the African American Methodist Episcopal Church, one of the largest Black congregations in Los Angeles to this day. A monument in Los Angeles honors her remarkable achievements. In speaking up for her own freedom, Biddy Mason spoke up for the humanity of all Black people.
So in keeping with I'm sorry, I'm just gonna have to, give me 1 second here. I just wanted to share one last story with you about, again, this whole idea of Black agency, and really about even people who were free really going out of their way when they saw other people who were enslaved to try to help them get free. And this last story I want to share. It's just a really powerful story that was actually produced by KQED, which was one of our partners on the Gold Chains project. And I'm just going to play a short bit of this for you.
I'm sitting in the first row of St. Andrew's African Methodist Episcopal Church, right up close so I can hear the choir. All around me, pews are filled with worshipers, mostly older Black folks, and many have been coming here for generations. St. Andrew's is the first African American church on the West Coast.
Good morning, St. Andrews. St. Andrews is the best kept secret in the entire city of Sacramento.
This is Reverend Philip R. Cousin Jr.
We were organized prior to statehood, so that gives us a bit of a foothold here.
St. Andrews was founded in 1850, a few months before California entered the Union as a free state. But many African Americans were still brought here as slaves during the gold rush. This church was created by them.
It was established by free and former slave people of color who come into an area, and the first thing that is done is to establish a community. And at the center of that community is always a church.
And the man at the center of that church, the man who founded it, was named Daniel Blue. He's not someone they tell you about in school, but his story altered the course of California history. Daniel Blue was a former slave from Kentucky who came to California as a free man and made a fortune mining on the Sacramento River. He opened a laundry and bought a house right next door to the pro-slavery governor. Unafraid, he started the church and held its first service in his basement.
You take a Daniel Blue with everything to lose and very little to gain by putting himself out in the way that he did in this community, and yet that is what he did by choice. And that speaks to a strength of character that I like to think came from the church.
In the church, Daniel Blue even opened a school for Black and Native American children, soliciting money when the state refused to fund it. And so St. Andrews became ground zero for anti-slavery and social justice activism.
In Sacramento, it was St. Andrews that was able to pull together a coalition of people of color and say, look, we can go to the court and demand these rights. We can go to the state and demand to be counted as citizens.
As the first Black church in California, it became the model for other African Methodist Episcopal churches around the state. In a word, Daniel Blue's influence was
revolutionary.
But Daniel Blue left another mark that even the Reverend didn't know about. He freed California's last known slave. I wonder how we can know so little about a man with such a huge impact. So to learn more, I came here to the Center for Sacramento History. Kim Hayden is an archivist who's helping me sift through these 100-year-old court records.
We have things like this 1864 probate case, which is the actual file written in 1864.
So this is the case. The case is People v. Gammon in the matter of guardianship of Ada, aka Edith. Edith was a 12-year-old slave brought to rural Sacramento from Missouri. Walter Gammon was a local farmer who illegally bought her. This is 1864. It's nearly 15 years after California became a free state. Witnesses say Gammon beat Edith and left her without care or clothing. But somehow Daniel Blue heard about Edith. So he filed a petition in county court, which forced Gammon to bring the girl to the judge.
This is the habeas corpus for her. Reading. We command you that you have the body of Ada, a colored female child by you.
In response, Gammon, the slave owner, said Edith was there, quote, of her own free will.
And it was such a typical slaveholder response. Like, oh, I'm taking care of her. I provide for her. I'm giving her room and board. I feed her. I clothe her, which is what like Southern slaveholders would say. Like, what would they have without us?
So Daniel Blue requested that he become Edith's legal guardian. And the judge ruled in his favor, saying that Gammon had, quote, unlawfully and illegally detained and restrained Edith. What makes this case so significant is the timing, because only a year before Daniel Blue's petition to the state courts, California lifted a law prohibiting African Americans from testifying. So Daniel Blue saw an opportunity and he took it. And those Black witnesses, the people who detailed how Edith was abused, were able to testify on a young slave's behalf.
Okay, in conclusion, I just wanted to finish up with the California Reparations Task Force because a lot of the history that I just shared with you is some of what the task force is going to be looking into as they examine, and we're talking about California government, institutions, their role in slavery. And when you look at, essentially what that meant was kind of, theft of wealth. I mean, certainly when you're looking at cases like the miners that I mentioned earlier, that $100,000 that they had was basically seized, because of the government. And so the Reparations Task Force has been meeting since June, and they will eventually produce a report that will go to the legislature, which will then decide, what the next steps are going to be. So in closing, I just wanted to add that, since the podcast, I mentioned we did since the launch of the website, we did one podcast. We now have a second one that we've just wrapped up. I'm really excited about, and it's actually a spinoff of the testimony laws. And that will be coming out in February. And I'd love it if you would listen to it and share it. And I'll make sure that we send the link for you all so you know where to find it. And I just want to leave you with that. And, thank you so much for your time and attention. Look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Drummond. That was an informative presentation. And so I'll remind the audience that we are collecting your questions in the Q&A feature. That's the easiest way for us to see them. So please put your questions there. We have one that's come in already, asking about how did enslaved people get their freedom? Like, did they get a paper from a court? Was it something done on an individual basis? Like, can you inform us of maybe kind of the process of how that worked?
Sure, there's a couple of ways that people could get freedom. One is what they call manumission papers, also known, more commonly as freedom papers. And that would be something that the enslaver would fill out this document, legal document, to say that I'm giving you your freedom. And this would supposedly be a legal document. The problem with that is that those papers could often be stolen, thrown away. And because you have the fugitive slave law in California, if this happens to you and someone steals your freedom papers and you're not even allowed to come to court to testify on your own behalf to say that you're free. So any random person, if you're a Black person, any random white person can say, that's my slave, and you have no defense. Now, the other way is through going to court, which is some of what I just discussed, where people would run away. If they were fortunate, they would get support, financial support, to be able to hire good attorneys. And they would have a chance of, being freed in a court. But those results were kind of mixed, as you saw with the fugitive slave case. The state Supreme Court said, you have no rights at all, and shipped them back. And the Archie Lee case, it was too long to get into, but he had a couple of court setbacks before he was actually finally freed. But those were pretty much the way that people gained their freedom.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit more about the other groups that helped you on this project?
Sure. In terms of the website, we started a partnership with KQED, which is our media partner, the California Historical Society, the Equal Justice Society, and an author named Laura Atkins, who wrote a book about Biddy Mason. And in fact, there are some drawings from that, and we used her book heavily for the video that we made about Biddy Mason. But they were the partners. I mean, ACLU did all of the research, and we created the website, but they were partners in other elements of just trying to get the history out there. I mean, for instance, KQED aired a couple of stories about the project. And there were other events that took place that other partners sponsored.
Thank you. Are you getting any feedback from people who are using the website or using the podcast?
We have gotten feedback. When we launched, it was kind of right a couple of months later, COVID hit. So that kind of took the wind out of our sails a bit. But since the task force became law and the commission has been meeting, there's a lot of interest in the material, especially from educators. We had a couple of webinars where we had a couple of hundred teachers come on, wanting to know how they could incorporate some of the Gold Chains material into their lesson plans. We've gotten a lot of coverage in the media, which has been good also.
Thank you. We have a question about if California was a free state, why didn't they have laws to punish whites for bringing in slaves from other states? Was there ever anything like that? What made California a free state?
Well, what made it a free state was the language that was in the Constitution, the state constitution. The issue was that they did not practice the language in the Constitution and apply that language across the board to all people. So that's why that did not occur. I mean, that did not occur because, as I mentioned before, the Southern kind of cause had a lot of power in elected government. And they also, convinced themselves that the federal constitution, that the United States government basically gave them the right to their quote unquote property. So that's why that happened.
All right, and I'm getting some questions in the chat and the Q&A, so please try to put them in the Q&A. We can keep track of them a little bit better that way. Have you been able to use first-person accounts by people who were freed, such as recordings or diaries written by freed people later in their lives?
Unfortunately, we looked very hard, but we were not able to find any kind of, narratives of people here. The closest thing to that we found was a manumission paper from a man who had been enslaved working in the gold mines. And it was we saw his manumission papers, but we were not able to get any kind of, or find anything like that, any kind of firsthand accounts. That's very difficult in California.
Was that an exciting process of going into the historical record and looking for these rare documents? I don't know, as lawyers, maybe you do or don't have that experience. Was it different to kind of put on a historian's hat, so to speak?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm a journalist. So I love the research. To me, it was really exciting. I mean, you start with just a little piece of information and it just takes you, it just takes you through this incredible history that, I knew nothing about any of this history. And I consider myself, I love history, but this was just not a part of history that I knew anything about. So there were all kinds of discoveries. So yeah, it was a very, very, and it continues to be a very exciting project for us.
Has Gold Chains gotten any pushback from any groups or people?
We've had on our website, some people make some, kind of not very nice comments, but we have not, no one's really taken our project like they've done with the 1619 project and just sort of used it in that way, fortunately. We haven't had that experience. It's generally been very positive and, just from people wondering, first of all, they had no idea about the information. And again, with educators, especially wondering how they can, get more of this into their own curriculums.
Within the Gold Chains project, do you have any efforts to teach our students about the Black history that predates the institution of slavery?
Well, in California, that's not really, so you're talking about before statehood, or I'm not sure I understand the question, because when California was founded, slavery was raging. And actually there really were not very many there were some Black people here, but when you really see Black people coming into California was really 1848. And, slavery was already enforced then. So we don't really get into that much into pre-statehood, just those couple of years right before statehood.
Okay, so let me just We've got quite a few questions coming in. What are your hopes regarding the reparation process? Where do you think will be the benefits of this profound work? Thank you very much for the presentation.
So I think the question is, what are the benefits from our work and what I hope comes from the Reparations Commission? Is that the question?
Yes.
Well, for our work, what we were really trying to do is to present history that people did not know about that could also hopefully help inform the work of the Reparations Commission. And they actually have been, some of them have been pretty receptive to the work. As far as what I hope will come out of the commission, I hope that there will be an honest discussion about the fact that, even though none of us was around when these terrible things were happening, I mean, there are very real impacts from what happened. And especially when you look at, the theft of wealth from Black people. And I think that if you accept that this is the history that occurred, then we need to figure out, okay, well, how does that debt get addressed? I mean, when you can look today and see, the impact on these communities. So I would just like to have just sort of an honest discussion. And, there seems to be a lot of research that's being done by the panel and the different people that they're bringing in. Because I think the knee-jerk reaction has always been, well, reparations, I mean, why should we do that? And, how would we even know who to give it to? And I just think that that's kind of a cop-out. I mean, if we accept that this was the history and we see everywhere we look what the legacy of that history is, then it only makes sense that we, try to figure out how to move forward in a meaningful way.
Thank you. This next question, I think, is asking about, there are recordings of slave narratives that were done maybe in the 1900s. Do you know if any of those included people who were enslaved in California?
I know about some of the narratives that you're referring to. I am not aware of anything that was done in California.
Okay.
That doesn't mean there aren't any. I'm just not aware of any.
There's a lot of misinformation about critical race theory. Do you feel that you can give an accurate definition of it? And do you think anyone is currently teaching or using it?
I think there's a very technical definition for critical race theory, and I'm not the expert on it. I can only tell you that based on what I have read about it, it's really looking at how some of these issues, such as some of the issues that I talked about, how that history impacts present and present institutions. And so that, you didn't just have history and kind of it ended and that was that. I mean, that there is this legacy. And I think that kind of is at the core of what critical race theory is about. But, I think for a more detailed definition, you'd have to go to somebody like, Kimberly Crenshaw or some of these other folks that have done a lot of work in that space.
Thank you. Junipero Serra was a slaveholder, and that's a name that we know here in California. Will any of that history be included in a future podcast or future material in the Gold Chains?
We are planning our third podcast, which will deal with some of the history of slavery of Indigenous people, which is also a part of the Gold Chains project. As far as Sarah, I don't know if we'll be doing anything particularly with that, but we are going to be working on something involving the enslavement of Indigenous children which happened under another law that the legislature passed also in 1850, that basically allowed settlers to, pretty much turn children into slaves by basically saying that their parents were unfit. And that happened a lot. Or you'd have, villages that would be kind of massacred, and then the children would be taken and enslaved. So we are definitely going to have an episode about that.
We had one question about the video on Biddy Mason, and I believe that video is available on the website. Is that?
It is. It's on YouTube. That video.
So is it pretty easy to find just by?
Very easy.
Okay. And we have one last question, and it's a great one to kind of close out. What can we do as PTA members to support the Gold Chains Project, and any suggestions on how to best share this information?
I'm so glad you asked. I will let you know the podcast next episode is going to be coming out on February 24th, Black History Month. I will make sure that you get a link to that when it comes out. And please just share the link to the website. And, I think you guys are already doing, just really great stuff, just being, first of all, pushing for some kind of actual teaching of the real history. And I would just say, if you are able to incorporate some of, the work that we've done to help you in that effort, that would be fantastic. But please, we definitely encourage you to share it with, whoever might be receptive to the material, people who may not be receptive to the material, because we're just trying to, get as much of this out as we can. Because like I say, a lot of people just have no idea of this history.
All right, thank you. This has been an engaging conversation. Thank you all for contributing with your questions. And thank you, Ms. Drummond, for participating in our PTA guest speaker series. PTA appreciates the opportunity to learn, and we give you a virtual round of applause right now. So we did have the Gold Chains link in the chat. I saw it posted earlier. Maybe a helper can post that again. And there's more stories there that you can explore. And a recording of tonight's event will be posted soon on the 6th District PTA YouTube channel. And I ask you to save the date for 3 weeks from tonight on Thursday, February 10th at 6:30 p.m. 6th District PTA will be back here hosting a Black History Month presentation on Black intellectual history. And the registration link for that will be coming out in the coming days. So look for it in your 6th District newsletter or on the 6th District PTA social media. And one last time, thank you, Ms. Drummond, for spending time with us today. When we close out, everybody is going to get bumped out of the webinar. So on behalf of everyone, I say a good day to us all. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.